History as it happens, November 18th, 2021. King George was not mad.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal,
that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights,
that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Everyone knows the opening words of the Declaration, but when was the last time you read its 28-count indictment against King George III, accusing him of establishing an absolute tyranny over the colonies? And what if we told you only 2 of the counts were true? Fact is, much of what we're taught about the last King of America is bunk. Not only wasn't King George mad, he really wasn't all that bad. For a king. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
People tended to like the fact that he was good-natured and charming and quite intelligent. And so, yes, he was popular in America as well as in Britain.
We all know the story. Way back in the 1760s and 70s, Parliament and King began to oppress the freedom-loving colonists, imposing taxes, quartering troops, violating their rights as subjects of the crown. Just read the Declaration of Independence, the bottom half. Thomas Jefferson pens a ferocious indictment of George III. But only 2 of those 28 counts were true.
Yeah, but the 2 that do, the 17th, which is about taxation, and the 22nd, which is about Parliament having veto rights over American laws, those in and of themselves justify the whole revolution in themselves.
Andrew Roberts is author of The Last King of America, The Misunderstood Reign of George III. Our conversation is coming up in a moment. Now, we don't usually interview authors on this podcast just because they have a new book out, but we weren't going to turn down the chance to speak to Andrew Roberts, who is one of the best biographers around. But I also wanted to talk to him because we love to take on origin stories here. Think about your grade school social studies classes and what you remember about those men in powdered wigs at the Continental Congress. No taxation without representation. Well, that slogan actually appeared for the first time in a headline of London Magazine in 1768 above Lord Camden's speech on the Declaratory Bill of the Sovereignty of Great Britain over the Colonies, a speech first delivered in Parliament. Yes, Parliament. The American colonies had defenders, if not elected representatives, in the House of Commons. But in the origin story all of us are taught when children, King George plays the role of villain, although he was not a tyrant. But if you come to the conclusion that he and Parliament weren't all that tyrannical, if the taxes in question were tiny, if no British soldiers were actually quartered inside private homes against the will of their occupants, then maybe some of our founding fathers' claims don't ring so true anymore. What about King George's madness, as depicted in a critically acclaimed and award-winning movie in 1994?
But by God, I'm bolder. Not look at me, I'm not one of your... Thomas!
You must behave, or endeavor to do so.
Must! Must! Whose must is this? Your must or my must? Get away from me, you scabby bumsucker. Lick at your lick fingers!
And there's a musical, you may have heard of it, Hamilton, where the king is pompous and comically incompetent.
Insane! You cheat with the French, now I'm fighting with France and with Spain.
Well, we now know George suffered from bipolar disorder. He had a mental illness that today is treated with medicine and hopefully compassion. He was not a raving lunatic, to use an archaic term. Andrew Roberts is a great historian who has authored major biographies of Napoleon and Churchill, as well as histories of the Second World War. And his latest is, as mentioned, The Last King of America, The Misunderstood Reign of George III. Andrew Roberts, we're delighted to have you.
Thank you very much indeed, Martin.
Congratulations on another marvelous book. As I read it, my sense was you wrote a biography, a history, but also a defense of your subject, not an uncritical one, I should say. What brought you to King George III?
Well, I'd written about Napoleon before, and so obviously was interested in the King of England throughout the Napoleonic Wars. And I'd long thought that he had been hard done by history, that George III had a better case than had been made for him up until now. There'd only been one cradle-to-the-grave biography written of him in the last half century.
And documents recently became available that gave you insights into George's life that had not been available for centuries, right?
That's right. And I couldn't have written the book without reading them. The Queen has made 100,000 pages of George III's papers and correspondence and archive and so on available via the Georgian Papers Project, which is a wonderful thing. Basically, the Royal Archives and King's College London have got together and made these available. So it's absolutely central. New information is central to this book.
You were able to read his personal letters. His handwriting actually is pretty legible. You have a photo of one of the letters in the book.
It's very lucky that. It's not always the case. When you write about Napoleon, for example, it's next to impossible to read these spidery scripts, whereas George III had a much better handwriting.
Well, I like the title of your book because it serves as a reminder, The Last King of America, as if to say, hey, you Americans, remember, before you had a president, you had a king, and you liked him a lot. Even in 1760, maybe even as late as 1770, in the early 1770s, if you were to have a poll of the colonists of the 13 North American colonies, they would have responded positively about their king, right? Why is that?
I think that's true, yes. And possibly until even later than that, 1773, 1774 perhaps, probably the Boston Tea Party and the response to it, I think, was a turning point, especially the response to it. Yes, he was a popular monarch. He was a Briton. He was the first person to be born and raised in England, first king for a very long time. He was proud of that. And people tended to like the fact that he was good-natured and charming and quite intelligent. And so, yes, he was popular in America as well as in Britain.
Before we get into the details of George's life, I'd like to get your thoughts on the following. I've produced a few episodes this year about the American Revolution, all aiming to strip away the myths and simplifications that shroud our understanding of that event. And for an event of such surpassing importance as the Revolution, it's somewhat amazing how little so many of us really know about it. I'm talking about modern-day American citizens. Here's an example. I spoke to Alan Taylor a couple of months ago about the violence of the Revolutionary War period committed by patriots against loyalists, loyalists against patriots, both body and property. But that violence doesn't play a prominent part in our popular memory. We tend to think instead of the men in powdered wigs in Philadelphia were tidy battles in fields far away from population centers, not the sheer viciousness and brutality of our founding moments. So that's a very long way of saying, Andrew Roberts, that what we choose to remember about our origins really matters because those stories define us. I got the sense as I read your book that you wanted to correct the record about a really important piece of the American origin story.
I think that's right. And you're certainly right about the violence. Also, tarring and feathering was a tremendously violent thing to do to somebody, incredibly painful process to have boiling tar put on your skin. And so, yes, I think you're right. But what I try to get to really is to argue that it was the right thing for the American Revolution to take place in 1775. You had this fantastic burgeoning economy. You had 2.5 million people. You had as many bookshops in Philadelphia as you had anywhere in the empire apart from London. So it was natural, especially as after the end of the French and Indian Wars, you had no strategic threat from France in the North American continent any longer. And so it was the right moment for the founding fathers to grab their opportunity and grasp independence. But that doesn't mean that George III was a tyrant or a despot or any of the things that late 18th century tyrants and despots were. He didn't prevent the Stamp Act Congress or the First Continental Congress from meeting. He never arrested any editors or closed down newspapers. Apart from Boston, he didn't station troops in any of the big American cities. You know, these are the things that tyrants did in the late 18th century and almost defined them. And George III didn't do them and wasn't one.
And it wasn't a question of him not having the ability to do it either. He might have tried had he really wanted to.
Yeah, and also if you look at what is going on in Russia with Catherine the Great, who kills 50,000 people during the Pugachev uprising, and France in Corsica, the Spanish in Louisiana and the New Orleans uprising, you know, there are plenty of tyrants around at the time who didn't mind bloodbaths in order to keep themselves in power. And yet George III really followed the English common law, even in examples like the Boston Massacre. those people were put on trial. That is not what a tyranny does.
And as you point out, even after the Boston Massacre, colonists still erected a lead statue of the king in New York City. Maybe now's a good time to discuss just what kind of monarch King George III was. He was not an absolute monarch. He was a constitutional monarch, as was his grandfather and great-grandfather. So there's some context here. His power was restrained by what had happened in the previous century, right, in England.
Especially, of course, the Glorious Revolution of 1688. That's the thing that he looked back to. And of course, it was also the thing that the American revolutionaries looked back to. The founding fathers very much wanted to cover themselves in the mantle of the revolutionaries of 1642 against Charles I and 1688 against James II. And so what they needed really was an absolutist Stuart monarch who believed in the divine right of kings. And George III was undoubtedly not that. He was a constitutional monarch who'd just been brought over from Hanover, his family brought over because they were not absolute.
He was German by ethnicity. Is that the right way of putting it?
He was because of his father and grandfather and so on. But actually, he was the first king for a very long time to be born and raised in England. That's with right. English as his first language, no German accent, and so on. And so when he met the state opening of Parliament for the first time, he said, born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain. And that was a tremendously popular thing to have said, and it was true.
He had to govern through his ministers. He could appoint his ministers, but then those ministers, in turn, needed support for their policies in an elected House of Commons. So there was a constellation at work there.
Yes, and it was very factional. Right? It wasn't the sort of political parties that we know today, which are quite solidified. It was a very factional thing. They followed individuals, usually cousins of theirs. There were lots of family memberships that explained which faction you were a part of. Although the Whigs and the Tories did have different ideologies, there were so many independent members moving between them and so many factions within them that it was a multifarious politics.
I had actually planned to get to the politics later on, but we'll stick with it now since I brought it up. I was amazed, having not read a lot about this period of British history for a while, at the extent to which factionalism, jealousy, rivalry influenced the appointment of ministers and the formation of governments, or cabinets, if you will, more so than merit in many cases. And during crises that required consistent policy-making instability. We're talking about the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War. George comes to the throne in 1760, so that war is still going on. And then, of course, the crisis with the American colonies. This was one area where George III struggled. Why did he struggle so much in this area?
Well, because he wasn't, like George II or George I, a convinced Whig. He didn't go along with the Whig oligarchy, the people who essentially had been in power for 80 years by the time he came to the throne, and certainly 70 years. He didn't think that he should be forced just to choose from them, this gigantic aristocratic cousinhood. He also wanted to be able to choose Tories if he thought that they would be good ministers, independents, Scottish. He wanted a wider pool and a less partisan pool from which to draw the best people into his government. And that, of course, extremely irritated the oligarchic Whigs, who, for the whole of the rest of his reign, really, he was up against.
It's really remarkable the extent to which he was detested by some people and openly criticized. To your point about him not being a nasty despot, some rather ugly things were said about him in the presses. Some of it was anonymous. I mean, there were some cases of seditious libel brought against publishers, but for the most part, he allowed people to criticize him publicly.
That's right. And he actually also, of course, was unlucky enough, in a sense, to reign during the age of the great caricaturists, Isaac Cruikshank and Thomas Rowlandson, James Gilray and the rest of them. And so they constantly took the rise out of him in their cartoons. And he just collected them. He had people go off and buy the cartoons, and he made a big collection of them. He didn't try to use the law against them in the way that he did against John Wilkes. But that wasn't because of anything John Wilkes said about him, so much as the horrible, loathsome libels that he said about George III's mother, claiming that she was the mistress of the Prime Minister, which simply was not the case.
Clearly, Parliament and the King were slow to realize how unpopular imperial policies were becoming in the American colonies. Well, before I go on to the rest of this question, do you agree with that they were slow to realize what was going on?
Yes, they were. They should have spotted it with the sugar tax. They didn't. And then, obviously, the Stamp Act. They thought that because the Stamp Act was raising such a small amount of money, between 40 and 60,000, between 2.5 million people, or at least 1.9 million non-slaves in the colonies. You had 600,000 enslaved African Americans who obviously weren't going to be paying the stamp tax, but the rest would. And so the numbers were absolutely tiny. It was only sort of 2 shillings and sixpence per year per American. But what they didn't recognize properly was that the people who would be paying the stamp tax were people like lawyers and journalists and other people who buy ink by the barrel and who are therefore in a position to make a lot of noise about it.
An intelligent, articulate cadre of revolutionaries, as you point out in your book, who were able to bring public opinion along with them as time went on. You raise this fascinating counterfactual that George III could have visited or even permanently relocated to America, but it was never even considered.
Right. I mean, he never considered it. No, you're right. The Hanoverians had only been in Britain since 1714. After all, they were carpetbaggers to all intents and purposes, and so they'd only been there less than half a century by the time he came to the throne. And what would stop them from just using Britain in the same way as they had used Hanover, and actually moved on to the country which had the proper potential, had an entire sort of continental potential? If they'd been able to look 100 years into the future and see the United States being the most powerful nation in the world, then George III would have packed his bags and moved to New York, but obviously he wasn't capable of doing that. The interesting thing, I think, was that he not only didn't go to America, but he also was King of Scotland and Ireland. He never went there either. He was Elector of Hanover. He never went there. He never went north of Worcester or west of Plymouth. It was an extraordinary lack of emotional interest, really, in his own realm.
Not a lack of intellectual interest.
No, huge intellectual interest. You know, this is a man whose library, the 80,000 books of his library, form the basis of the British Library today. He founded the Royal Academy. He built up half the present-day Royal Collection, which is the largest private art collection in the world. He was a huge supporter of Georgian architecture, of course, the neoclassical tradition in that. He had the largest collection of scientific instruments in the world. He was fascinated by astronomy. The planet Uranus was named after him, and he was a supporter of Haydn and Handel and Mozart. You know, he played 4 instruments. But this is not the man that Tom Paine called the royal brute of Britain in Common Sense. He was the exact opposite of a brute. He was a highly cultured man.
I do agree with Thomas Paine, though, when it comes to monarchy in general, when he called it an artificial contrivance. I hope I'm not insulting you, Andrew Roberts.
Do name me a constitutional innovation that is not an artificial contrivance.
Well, I suppose some are less harmful than others. Back to the point about the crisis in the colonies and the king's response to it. From an American perspective, as we look at our own history, that was the event of the time. But on the other side of the Atlantic, from the king's perspective, he had any number of other issues he was dealing with that distracted him from what was happening in the colonies, right?
Yes, and I do go in my book into this business with John Wilkes, the sort of radical, noisy, outrageous, rumbustious journalist who did go out of his way to irritate and frustrate and annoy the government. Instead of just sort of letting him get on with it as the sort of gadfly that he was, they went into extraordinary lengths to try to silence him and indeed imprison him for criminal libel, which they managed to do at one stage. And that showed the way that the government could be presented as being heavy-handed and oppressive. And it's certainly something that was picked up a lot in the United States. But equally, he was in a difficult position because George III was in a difficult position because he had made these libels about his mother and the Prime Minister, which he didn't feel at least he could just completely ignore.
This guy, Wilkes, had a following, a real following.
He had a real following, and that following made itself very clear when it would riot whenever Wilkes was imprisoned. And Wilkes kept standing for Parliament, and every time he was elected, then the House of Commons would strike it down, and then he'd go back to Middlesex, and the electors of Middlesex would elect him again. This happened 4 times. And I'm afraid it meant the government really did have their eye taken off the ball when issues such as the sugar tax and the stamp tax became so unpopular in America.
The Stamp Act crisis, 1765 to 66, a key turning point, as was the Boston Tea Party. So Parliament and King, they keep chalking up these troubles to a small group of troublemakers or radicals or, with reason, greedy smugglers and merchants, especially when it came to the tea issue. It was in late 1773, the Tea Party and the aftermath, when George goes from being conciliatory to harsher in his stance toward America. But he wasn't the only one.
Exactly. No, that's the point I was going to point out, that in fact his initial stance was not to be tough. It was to continue the conciliatory policy, but Lord North's government, and especially the hardliners in the government, including Lord Hillsborough, wanted to be tough and to close down the port of Boston until such time as they got the money back for all the tea that had been thrown in the harbour. And interestingly, it did slightly split the colonists, because George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and other people who believed in property rights condemned the actions of the Boston Patriots in throwing the tea into the harbour. George III assumed that no other colony would stand by Massachusetts if they came down hard on Massachusetts. And the reason that he thought that was because the royal governors told him that, including the governor of Massachusetts. And they couldn't have got that more wrong because, of course, in the event, the other 12 colonies, apart from Georgia, which was quite loyalist, the others tended to stick together with Massachusetts. And the result, of course, ultimately was the First Continental Congress.
And you argue in your book that as king of the British Empire, what was George supposed to do? Now, at this point, 1773, early 74, it's not entirely clear that the colonists are going to go all the way to independence. But at the same time, what kind of king is going to allow 13 important colonies to simply secede without any resistance to that?
Well, absolutely. And you don't get that in world history until 1905, when Norway and Sweden split off from one another. You know, up until that point, and I hardly need to mention this to an American because of what happened 7 years after the American War of Independence, you know, secession was met by a violent response. You didn't just shrug your shoulders and allow the founding fathers to set up a new country out of your colonies without at least having a go at fighting them.
But at the same time, is it fair to say that earlier than he did, George III should have realized that there was no way to keep the colonies in the empire, that the war was unwinnable?
Yes, he listened probably too much, again, to the hardliners in the cabinet, the people who didn't take enough regard to the fact that we have a 3,500-mile ocean and that every soldier, that 35,000 or so that was going to be shipped out to America, required at least 1/3 of a ton of supplies and ammunition and food and so on. And so that just sheer logistically, it was going to be a tremendously difficult war to win.
I got the sense when reading your book, maybe I read between the lines a little too much, but that's why you're here to correct me if I'm wrong. When it came to matters of the British Constitution and the law, that Parliament and King were actually on the right side of history, that they had every right to tax the American colonists, and it was the colonists who resorted to violence and illegality to thwart what would have been tiny taxes. This argument runs counter to the American founding principle of the right of a people to violently overthrow an abusive government.
Yes, I don't think the government was abusive, but it had to be violently overthrown if you were going to become the independent and self-governing nation, which, as I say, a century later became the most powerful nation in the world.
Thomas Jefferson, someone whose mind I truly admire. He really got the king wrong. And of course, it's Jefferson's indictment of the king in our Declaration of Independence. Well, to the extent that Americans read the rest of the document beyond the opening magisterial lines, would Jefferson get an F for accuracy if he handed in those on a test?
He'd get an A for English, an A++ for English, undoubtedly. No, you've got to give him that. Those opening lines, as you say, the first third of the document, in fact, is a wonderful Shakespearean sublime piece of writing that makes you proud to be human. It's only after that, in the second two-thirds of the document, where he comes up with 28 personal ad hominem charges against George III, where he, I'm afraid, does get an F, yes, because only 2 of the 28 are hold water. However,
only
the
2
that do, but the 2 that do, the 17th, which is about taxation, and the 22nd, which is about Parliament having veto rights over American laws, those in and of themselves justify the whole revolution in themselves. But the other 26 are a combination of ex post facto rationalizations, massive exaggerations, some things that he's accused of, like taking people abroad for being put on trial, which never happened. There wasn't a single person who was transported over there.
Or foisting slavery on the colonies. I think that actually got expunged.
That got cut out, obviously, because the committee must have had a sense of hypocrisy there to have even thought about keeping that one in. If we could just talk about slavery just for 1 second.
Absolutely. I was going to bring it up next.
I'm sure, but nonetheless, this is the ideal time. I think George III never bought or sold a slave in his life. He never owned a slave. He never owned shares in any of the companies that did that. He signed the legislation that abolished the slave trade. And yet he's seen, and has been for 200 years by historians, to be on a lower moral level than the 41 out of the 56 signatories of the Declaration of Independence who did own slaves at some stage in their lives, which I do find ludicrous.
Slavery in the colonies was not under threat from Parliament at the time of the Revolution, but if you had to choose who was a despot, Thomas Jefferson or King George III, slavery is a form of despotism, and, I visit Monticello quite often, and although Thomas Jefferson himself never whipped any of the 600 slaves he owned during the course of his life, his overseers did. There's no such thing as a kind form of slavery. All of it was a form of despotism.
Yes, and George III also never slept with anyone other than his wife. Another point in his favor with regard to vis-a-vis Mr. Jefferson.
He was an enlightened monarch in your view?
I do think so, and also something of a Renaissance prince as well, because of all those things we mentioned earlier about his interests and his achievements. He was a benevolent king. He was interested in his American subjects. We know that from these papers that the Queen has made available, the number of books that he bought about America, the topographical maps, the number of times he met leading Americans whenever they came to London. He met the Native American chieftains as well when they came over. He was not this kind of snooty, distant figure who showed no interest in his American subjects at all. A completely different kind of person.
I want to get to George's supposed madness and what he was actually suffering from, but one more point about the American Revolution, because it's a founding principle of my country, straight out of the Enlightenment, that the only legitimate government is one that consults the consent of the people, therefore an unelected parliament, at least from the colonist point of view, they weren't voting for any representatives in the House of Commons, and a monarch could not be legitimate. Gordon Wood has written, what made the American Revolution radical was that the colonists went from seeing themselves as subjects, however much autonomy they enjoyed under their king, to citizens after they won the revolution. Your thoughts?
Yes, in a sense, what you're talking about essentially is no taxation without representation. But actually, the delegates to the Stamp Act Congress were told by their provinces, what later became states, not to accept representation if it were offered. That slightly undermines the great cry of no taxation without representation if representation was on the cards if they wanted it and they decided that they weren't going to accept it, which is true in the Virginian case and the South Carolinian case. And later on, obviously, once the war had started, there was going to be whatever the Americans wanted to make peace, including no taxation and self-government under a sort of home rule system.
His first bout of what you say or you argue was likely bipolar disorder or manic depression came in 1765. But then after 1810, basically for the rest of his reign, which ended in 1820, George III was incapacitated. He wasn't mad, which is kind of an archaic way of putting things. What was his problem health-wise?
Bipolar disorder affective type 1. He did not have porphyria. All the modern science that's looked at this, mine is the first book to say so, but for the last 10 years, there have been lots of learned articles in medical journals pointing out that it was not porphyria. It was a form of manic depression. And now, you see, now that we've destigmatized mental health and certainly mental illness in the last few years, we can actually get to a stage where we don't blame poor old George III for his own mental illness. We don't see it any longer as a sort of moral failing of his, but we can actually see it as the profound human tragedy that it actually was.
The fact that he was able to still rule his country in stressful times dealing with this disease is quite, courageous, I guess you would say.
Yes, until, of course, the last 10 years of his life when there had to be a regency because by that stage it had completely taken over his mind.
So do you hope Americans who read your book will give King George a second chance?
Well, I think America's a very, mature democracy. It should be able to recognize that it is exceptional in a way in that it did gain its own independence, its own self-government without having been oppressed. And that in itself is a pretty exceptional thing in history.
Andrew Roberts, we thank you for your time and congrats on your new book. So at a time when some folks glorify the American past and some want to just condemn the whole thing as a racist lie, Andrew Roberts reminds us the truth is more complicated. No nation's history is all good or all bad. Such simple dichotomies are obstacles to learning, and today they're also dividing our nation to the point of despair. On the next episode of History as It Happens, Xi Jinping forever. China's leader is joining the pantheon of communist autocrats as he holds his first summit with President Biden. What it means for the future of U.S.-China relations. Next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.